Hey guys. Settle here. Tonight we began how medieval pregnancy was treated like a moral crime. Diet rules, movement bans, bloodletting during labor, and survival roulette. But before we get started, make sure that you subscribed and comment me where are you watching from. When medieval society looked at pregnancy, it did not see a medical condition. It saw a test. A trial. A moral examination conducted inside a human body, with failure rates that modern insurance companies would describe as unacceptable. Pregnancy was not considered dangerous because it involved blood loss, infection, or physical strain. It was considered dangerous because it involved desire. And desire, in the medieval imagination, was already suspicious. A pregnant body was a body that had done something. And that something needed supervision. From the moment a woman was suspected to be pregnant, rules appeared around her like invisible walls. She was watched. Not carefully. Judgmentally. Advice poured in from midwives, priests, neighbors, older women who had survived, and men who had never experienced anything involved in the process but felt deeply qualified to comment anyway. Most of this advice contradicted itself. All of it was confident. Movement was dangerous. But so was resting too much. Eating was necessary. But eating the wrong thing could deform the child, invite demons, or corrupt the humors. Sex was forbidden. Unless it was necessary to balance the womb. Which was never clearly explained. The womb, in medieval medicine, was not an organ. It was a creature. It wandered. It sulked. It became angry. It reacted emotionally to smells, foods, music, and thoughts. A woman craving something was not experiencing a normal biological response. She was failing to control herself. And that lack of control was believed to mark the child permanently. If a pregnant woman thought of a rabbit, the child might be born timid. If she thought of fire, the child might be violent. If she looked at something ugly, the child might carry the curse of resemblance. This meant pregnancy required constant mental discipline. No fear. No anger. No longing. No sudden emotion. Which, as you may have noticed, is an excellent way to guarantee fear, anger, and longing. Food became a battlefield. Warm foods were encouraged. But not too warm. Cold foods were discouraged. But not entirely. Spices were dangerous. Unless prescribed. Meat was strengthening. Unless it was greasy. Fruit was moist. Moist was bad. Vegetables were suspicious. Especially raw ones. Wine was medicinal. But drunkenness harmed the fetus. Water was acceptable. But cold water shocked the womb. So women drank warm liquids. Often wine diluted with questionable water. Hunger was common. But fasting was praised. A woman who ate too eagerly was indulgent. A woman who ate too little was virtuous. If the pregnancy failed, neither approach was blamed. The woman was. Physical activity followed the same logic. Walking was healthy. But not too far. Climbing stairs could dislodge the womb. Reaching overhead was risky. Lifting objects could cause miscarriage. But lying down too much weakened the body. Pregnant women were encouraged to remain productive but gentle. Useful but restrained. Present but not visible. Work continued until the body forced it to stop. Because stopping voluntarily looked lazy. Pain was expected. Pain was proof the body was working. Pain was not treated. It was observed. Bleeding during pregnancy was common. Instead of being alarming, it was sometimes encouraged. Bloodletting could cool excess heat. Balance the humors. Prevent complications. Removing blood from someone already supporting another life was not considered risky. It was considered proactive. If dizziness followed, that meant balance was being restored. If fainting occurred, that meant the body was responding. If the pregnancy failed shortly after, that meant something had already been wrong. Medieval logic had a solution for every outcome. None of them involved admitting error. Midwives existed. They were experienced. They knew what actually helped. Which is precisely why they were distrusted. A midwife's knowledge came from repetition, not theory. From bodies, not books. This made her useful. And dangerous. Midwives were often the first to be blamed when something went wrong. Because they were present. Because they touched. Because they knew. And knowledge without church approval was suspicious. Especially when it belonged to women. Labor itself was not private. It was communal. Other women gathered. They prayed. They instructed. They restrained. The laboring woman was not the authority over her own body. She was the location where something was happening. If labor was long, it meant sin. If labor was short, it meant fortune. If the child lived, God was pleased. If the child died, God had judged something. No one asked what. They didn't need to. Someone had failed. Sometimes labor was accelerated with herbs. Sometimes slowed with prayers. Sometimes interfered with physically. Pulling. Pressing. Forcing positions. Comfort was not the goal. Completion was. Childbirth was something to be endured. Not managed. Pain relief was rare. Dangerous. Associated with witchcraft. A woman screaming too much was not coping well. A woman silent was praised. Even if silence came from exhaustion rather than strength. After birth, rest was limited. The body was expected to recover quickly. Milk production was assumed. If it failed, it was a moral issue. Wet nurses existed. But relying on them implied weakness. Infants were swaddled tightly. Movement restricted. Cold exposure was common. Because it built strength. Many infants did not survive. This was not considered shocking. It was tragic. But expected. Grief was controlled. Excessive mourning suggested lack of faith. Attachment was risky. Love was dangerous. Better not to hope too much. Better not to expect survival. Entire generations were shaped by this emotional restraint. Pregnancy was not a hopeful state. It was a dangerous negotiation. Between biology, belief, and blame. And despite everything, despite starvation, infection, bleeding, exhaustion, and judgment, women survived. Not because the system supported them. But because human bodies are stubborn. Because experience passed quietly between women. Because midwives whispered what worked. Because people adapted without permission. Medieval society did not make pregnancy safe. It made survival impressive. And somehow, enough people endured to continue the experiment. The danger did not end once the child arrived. In many ways, that was when scrutiny intensified. Because survival now had witnesses. A woman who lived through childbirth was not celebrated. She was evaluated. Her recovery was watched closely, not for comfort, but for meaning. Bleeding after birth was expected. Too much bleeding meant weakness. Too little meant corruption trapped inside the body. Either outcome could justify intervention. And intervention usually meant more bleeding. Postpartum bloodletting was practiced to cleanse the body. The logic was consistent. If pregnancy added substances, birth required removal. Balance had to be restored. Whether the woman survived that restoration was secondary. The womb, having released the child, was believed to be empty, unstable, and vulnerable. This was dangerous. An empty womb could wander. It could rise. It could press against organs. It could cause madness. The solution was warmth, pressure, and control. Women were bound. Their abdomens wrapped tightly. Their movement restricted. They were encouraged to stay indoors, near heat, breathing air thick with smoke and human presence. Fresh air was not healing. It was invasive. The body needed to close. To seal. To be guarded from intrusion. Bathing was discouraged. Water could enter places it did not belong. Cleanliness was risky. Sweat was purifying. Odor meant the body was working. If infection followed, it was rarely recognized as such. Fever meant imbalance. Chills meant excess cold. Pain meant the body was struggling to realign itself. The response remained the same. Herbs. Prayers. Bleeding. Sometimes mercury-based salves. Sometimes poultices made of animal fat and crushed plants. Sometimes nothing at all, because suffering was believed to be instructive. New mothers were expected to resume duties quickly. Not because their bodies were ready, but because households depended on labor. A woman who rested too long risked being seen as indulgent. Weakness could not be indulged. If she failed to recover, blame was internal. Her constitution was flawed. Her faith insufficient. Her discipline lacking. The child, meanwhile, became evidence. A healthy infant proved righteousness. A sickly one raised questions. Was the mother calm enough during pregnancy? Did she eat correctly? Did she think impure thoughts? Did she desire something she should not have? If the infant died, these questions hardened into conclusions. Stillbirths were especially dangerous. Not medically. Socially. A stillborn child occupied an uncomfortable space. It had existed. Then it had not. Baptism was often impossible. Which meant the soul's destination was uncertain. This uncertainty weighed heavily. On everyone. Especially the mother. Some communities treated stillbirth as misfortune. Others treated it as accusation. A woman who experienced repeated pregnancy loss was no longer unlucky. She was suspicious. Her body was marked as hostile. Unreliable. Potentially cursed. People whispered. Midwives watched her closely. Priests offered guidance that felt more like surveillance. Pregnancy announcements became cautious. Elaid. Hope was rationed. This emotional restraint shaped medieval family life profoundly. Parents did not assume children would survive. They prepared themselves for loss. Love existed. But it was tempered. Guarded. A way to survive emotionally when survival physically was uncertain. Children who lived past infancy were slowly allowed to become real. Names became meaningful only after time passed. Affection grew in stages. Not because medieval people were cold. But because grief was constant. And grief needed boundaries to remain survivable. This environment shaped women's identities from adolescence. A woman's value was tightly linked to her reproductive outcomes. Not just fertility. But success. Producing heirs. Producing workers. Producing bodies that would replace the dead. Failure was not private. It was communal. It affected inheritance, labor, lineage, and reputation. And so pregnancy became a performance. One monitored by family, neighbors, religious authority, and medical tradition. Every choice scrutinized. Every outcome interpreted. Rarely forgiven. Yet despite all of this, women developed quiet resistance. Not open rebellion. That was too dangerous. Instead, adaptation. Midwives passed down techniques discreetly. Certain herbs were used quietly. Positioning during labor improved outcomes when no one was watching. Women learned when to rest despite expectations. When to eat despite advice. When to ignore rules written by men who had never witnessed birth. This underground knowledge saved lives. Not dramatically. Incrementally. One birth at a time. But it remained unofficial. Unacknowledged. And always vulnerable to accusation. Because when something goes wrong in a system that cannot admit error, it must assign blame. And medieval society was excellent at assigning blame. Especially to women's bodies. As the centuries passed, some practices softened. Others hardened. Religion continued to frame pregnancy as both blessing and burden. A miracle that required punishment. A gift that demanded suffering. This contradiction never resolved. It simply persisted. Embedded in tradition. Repeated until it felt natural. From a modern perspective, medieval pregnancy looks brutal. And it was. But the cruelty was rarely intentional. It came from certainty. From rules built without evidence. From confidence that suffering had meaning. That pain purified. That survival proved virtue. Humanity came close to erasing itself not through malice, but through conviction. Through believing that hardship was instructional. That bodies needed discipline more than care. That survival required obedience. And somehow, through stubborn resilience and quiet defiance, people endured. Enough children lived. Enough mothers survived. Enough knowledge slipped through the cracks. Until eventually, centuries later, medicine began asking different questions. Not, what did you do wrong? But, what does the body need? That shift took time. And lives. And generations that never got the chance to be anything but examples. For now, let the weight of that settle. The silence after birth. The exhaustion. The relief mixed with fear. A world where survival was never assumed. Only negotiated. Slowly. Painfully. As medieval society moved forward, it did not replace these ideas. It layered new ones on top. Pregnancy remained a physical event wrapped tightly in moral interpretation, but now it also carried economic weight. Every child represented labor. Another set of hands for the field. Another body for the workshop. Another mouth, yes, but also a future solution to scarcity. This made pregnancy necessary. Which made it dangerous in a different way. Women were expected to endure it repeatedly. Spacing between births was not planned. It was endured. A woman might be pregnant, nursing, recovering, and pregnant again within a span that modern medicine would describe as a continuous medical emergency. The medieval body did not reset. It depleted. Iron deficiency was common. Chronic weakness was normal. Pain became background noise. This state was not treated. It was assumed. A woman who complained too often was accused of softness. A woman who stopped complaining altogether was praised. Even when silence meant collapse. Menstrual cycles were poorly understood. Irregularity was interpreted as imbalance. Or punishment. Amenorrhea from malnutrition was not recognized as starvation. It was seen as the body withdrawing fertility for moral reasons. The solution was not nourishment. It was correction. More heat. More bleeding. More prayer. Pregnancy that occurred during famine was especially dangerous. Not only biologically. Socially. Food scarcity sharpened judgment. A pregnant woman required extra nutrition. That made her a visible drain. Communities watched closely. Who ate more? Who rested? Who consumed resources while contributing less labor? Pregnancy stopped being sacred the moment survival tightened. Children born during famine were often weak. Small. Sickly. Their existence became proof that conception had been irresponsible. That restraint should have been practiced. That desire had again caused harm. even though medieval society had no reliable means of contraception. This contradiction did not trouble anyone. Responsibility was assigned regardless of feasibility. That is one of the quiet constants of human systems. Pregnancy also intersected with class. Noblewomen were guarded. Their bodies were political. Their pregnancies managed with relative comfort. Not safety, but resources. Better food. More rest. More attendance. Yet even here, danger remained. Noble births were pressured. Heirs mattered. Failure had consequences. A woman who could not produce a living male child could be discarded socially. Or replaced. Or quietly blamed for dynastic instability. Peasant women, by contrast, labored until the moment labor began. Sometimes delivering in fields. Sometimes on straw floors. Sometimes alone. Midwives could not always reach them. No one recorded these births. No one studied outcomes. Deaths disappeared into statistics that were never written. The system learned nothing. Because it did not look. And when something is not observed, it cannot improve. Religious interpretation filled the gap left by ignorance. Pain during childbirth was linked to original sin. Suffering was not accidental. It was deserved. Which meant alleviating it was questionable. Why interfere with divine order? Why soften a sentence handed down by God? This belief did enormous damage. Not because faith is inherently harmful, but because certainty without evidence resists correction. Medical innovation stalled. When something is explained as moral, it no longer needs investigation. This is one of the quiet ways humanity nearly erased itself. Not through violence, but through explanations that discouraged curiosity. Over time, rituals developed to manage fear. Charms. Amulets. Prayers spoken during labor. Objects placed near the bed to ward off spirits. Iron tools. Holy texts. Relics. These did nothing medically. But they did something psychologically. They gave structure. They gave meaning. They gave the illusion of control. In a world where mortality was constant, illusion mattered. It helped people continue. But it also prevented change. If a ritual appeared to work once, it was remembered. If it failed, the failure was attributed to insufficient faith. The ritual itself was never wrong. Women internalized this logic. They learned to view their bodies as unpredictable. Dangerous. Something that needed constant monitoring and correction. Trust in bodily signals was eroded. Pain did not mean stop. It meant endure. Fatigue did not mean rest. It meant weakness. This mindset carried forward. Generation after generation. Quietly shaping behavior. Even when circumstances changed. Even when better knowledge was available. This is how systems persist. Not because they are effective. But because they become normal. By the late medieval period, some physicians began questioning outcomes. Not loudly. Not publicly. But privately. Observations accumulated. Women who ate more survived more often. Those who rested longer recovered better. Those not bled excessively lived. These were dangerous conclusions. They challenged authority. Tradition. Texts written centuries earlier. And challenging texts was not safe. So progress was slow. Uneven. Hidden. Change did not arrive as a revolution. It seeped in through practice. Through midwives who ignored instructions. Through families who quietly fed pregnant women better. Through experience winning small battles against doctrine. Humanity did not stop harming itself all at once. It reduced the harm gradually. Often without acknowledging why. Which means the damage lasted far longer than it needed to. Millions of pregnancies occurred under conditions that made survival harder than it had to be. Not because people wanted suffering, but because they trusted systems that had never been tested. And when systems go untested long enough, they begin to feel eternal. Yet here we are. Which means enough women survived. Enough children lived. Enough quiet resistance existed to prevent extinction. Not triumphantly. Not heroically. Just persistently. History often remembers kings and wars. But survival depended on kitchens. On whispered advice. On ignored rules. On women doing what worked when no one was watching. Let that settle. The idea that humanity did not survive because it was wise, but because it adapted quietly inside bad systems until those systems weakened. The damage did not end with one generation. It echoed. Quietly. Persistently. Bodies carry memory even when societies refuse to. Women who survived repeated pregnancies under medieval conditions often carried lasting injuries. Pelvic damage. Chronic pain. Incontinence. Weakness that never resolved. These were not recognized as injuries. They were treated as personality traits. A woman who moved slowly was lazy. A woman who avoided work was difficult. A woman who complained of pain years after childbirth was dwelling on the past. Medicine had no category for long-term harm. If you lived, you were considered healed. Anything that followed was your own failure to adapt. This mindset shaped aging itself. Women aged faster. Not biologically. Functionally. By their 30s, many were physically exhausted. By their 40s, already treated as elderly. By their 50s, if they reached them, they were fragile. Not because age demanded it, but because the system had extracted everything early. And still, pregnancy continued. Because stopping was not an option. Widowhood did not always end childbearing. Remarriage was common. Fertility was currency. A woman's body remained a resource until it failed entirely. And when it failed, it became invisible. Children born into this environment absorbed these lessons early. Girls watched their mothers endure. They learned what was expected. Not through instruction. Through observation. They learned that pain was normal. That silence was strength. That asking for help was risky. That survival depended on compliance. Boys learned something else. They learned authority. They learned that bodies other than their own were managed by rule. That suffering had explanations that did not require solutions. That outcomes were moral. These lessons hardened into culture. And culture is harder to bleed out than any humor. Even joy during pregnancy was regulated. Too much happiness tempted fate. Celebration was cautious. Names were delayed. Cradles were not prepared too early. Hope was rationed. This emotional restraint protected people from grief. But it also limited attachment. Love was present. But muted. Measured. Delayed until survival seemed likely. Which, in medieval life, could take years. When children died, grief was private. Public displays were discouraged. Faith required acceptance. Acceptance required silence. Communities moved forward quickly. There was always more work. More births. More deaths. Life did not pause. And because it did not pause, trauma did not process. It accumulated. Quietly. Generationally. This accumulation shaped medieval temperament. The seriousness. The restraint. The deep familiarity with loss. People were not cold. They were cautious with emotion because emotion was expensive. It cost energy. Energy was needed to survive. This is why medieval humor often leaned dark. Why irony thrived. Why fatalism was common. When survival is uncertain, optimism becomes a luxury. Medical texts continue to circulate. Copied. Preserved. Repeated. The same errors passed forward. Bloodletting remained standard. Dietary restriction persisted. Pain continued to be interpreted as necessity. But small deviations grew. A midwife fed a woman more. A family ignored fasting rules during pregnancy. A husband shielded his wife from labor longer. These acts were not recorded. But they mattered. They were micro-adjustments. Tiny corrections to a massive system. This is how humanity survived itself. Not through reform. Through friction. Enough resistance to slow the damage. But not enough to stop it. It would take centuries. New ideas. New tools. New disasters. For real change. And even then, echoes remained. Many beliefs about pregnancy endured far beyond the medieval period. That suffering was natural. That endurance defined worth. That bodies must be disciplined. Even today, traces remain. Not because people are cruel. But because systems leave fingerprints. And fingerprints fade slowly. From a modern perspective, it's tempting to judge. To see medieval pregnancy as barbaric. But judgment misses the lesson. The danger was not ignorance. It was confidence. Confidence that explanation equaled understanding. That tradition equaled truth. That pain meant progress. These are timeless errors. They appear whenever systems stop listening to bodies. Whenever authority outweighs evidence. Whenever survival becomes proof instead of a question. Humanity came close to thinning itself out through pregnancy alone. Not because reproduction is dangerous. But because it was made dangerous by rules that ignored reality. And yet. Life continued. Quietly. Stubbornly. Generation after generation. Bodies adapted where beliefs would not. Women endured. Children lived. Enough to carry humanity forward. Not triumphantly. Not safely. But sufficiently. Which, in the medieval world, counted as success. Let the rhythm slow here. Let the weight ease. This was not cruelty by design. It was damage by certainty. And certainty, once installed, is very hard to remove. As the medieval world edged slowly toward its later centuries, the danger did not disappear. It normalized. By then, pregnancy had been folded so deeply into social expectation that questioning its management felt unnecessary. It simply was. Like winter. Like hunger. Like death. Medical thinking remained rooted in balance rather than evidence. Humors still ruled. Blood still mattered more than strength. A woman who survived childbirth was not considered resilient. She was considered properly aligned. If she died, the alignment had failed. Not the system. This distinction mattered. Because systems that blame individuals never correct themselves. By the 14th and 15th centuries, population loss from plague had created labor shortages. This changed pregnancy's role again. Now reproduction was not just expected. It was demanded. Communities needed bodies. Fields needed workers. Guilds needed apprentices. Wombs became infrastructure. Women were pressured, subtly and overtly, to replenish what disease removed. Marriage ages dropped in some regions. Remarriage accelerated. Widows were encouraged to return to fertility quickly. Grief was compressed. Recovery shortened. The body's limits were acknowledged only when they collapsed entirely. Even then, collapse was framed as unfortunate rather than preventable. Pregnancy advice adapted only slightly. More emphasis on prayer. More charms. More religious oversight. Because when pressure increases, superstition often follows. Control feels safer than uncertainty. The irony is that this period also produced more written observation. More records. More case notes. More marginal comments from physicians who noticed patterns they were not supposed to see. Women who ate better lived. Those who were not bled excessively survived more often. Infants kept warm fared better. These observations existed. But they lived in the margins. They did not become doctrine. Doctrine remained sacred. Experience remained anecdotal. And anecdotal evidence, even when consistent, was considered inferior to ancient texts written by men who had never seen childbirth. Authority, once established, resists correction fiercely. Especially when correction implies guilt. By now, fear had settled into ritual. Birth was surrounded by routine. Not because it worked. But because it was familiar. Familiarity reduces panic. And panic was dangerous. Communities needed births to happen calmly. Quietly. Predictably. Even if predictability included loss. Midwives continued to carry the real knowledge. They adjusted positions. They delayed interventions. They encouraged warmth. They recognized danger earlier than physicians. Which made them indispensable. And still dangerous. Because indispensable people who operate outside authority threaten hierarchy. As fear of witchcraft grew, midwives remained vulnerable. Too successful was suspicious. Too knowledgeable was unsafe. A midwife who saved many lives attracted attention. A midwife whose patients died attracted blame. Either outcome carried risk. Pregnancy thus existed inside contradiction. It was revered. And punished. Celebrated. And feared. Necessary. And morally suspect. Women navigated this contradiction daily. They learned when to be visible. When to disappear. When to comply publicly. When to resist privately. This psychological labor was constant. And exhausting. By the end of the medieval period, some shifts began. Slow ones. Universities expanded. Anatomy was studied more directly. Human bodies became subjects rather than symbols. But women's bodies remained excluded from this progress. Pregnancy was still treated as an exception. A sacred mystery. Which meant it remained protected from scrutiny. And therefore, from improvement. The long-term cost of this was not immediate extinction. It was attrition. Higher mortality. Lower life expectancy. Generational weakness. Communities constantly replacing the dead rather than building stability. Humanity did not nearly erase itself through one dramatic failure. It did so through thousands of small, confident decisions repeated daily. Through pregnancy treated as discipline. Pain treated as instruction. Survival treated as virtue. This pattern appears again and again in history. Whenever suffering is moralized, solutions slow. Whenever endurance is praised, care diminishes. Medieval pregnancy is not just a historical tragedy. It is a warning. That systems can be sincere. That beliefs can be comforting. That intentions can be pure. And still produce harm on a massive scale. The people involved were not cruel. They were certain. And certainty, unchecked, is one of the most dangerous substances humanity has ever produced. Let the room stay quiet here. Let the weight settle. Think of the millions of lives that passed through this system. Most unnamed. Most unrecorded. Yet essential. Because without them, there would be no continuation. No future to critique the past. Humanity survived medieval pregnancy not because it understood it. But because enough people endured it. And endurance, while admirable, is not the same as safety. Those beliefs did not vanish when the medieval period ended. They softened. They changed clothing. They learned new words. But they did not leave. They slipped forward quietly, carried not in books, but in habits. In expectations. In what people assumed was normal. When medicine slowly began to modernize, pregnancy followed reluctantly. Other parts of the body were dissected, measured, experimented on. Bones. Organs. Wounds. Pregnancy remained different. Still moral. Still emotional. Still treated as something that worked best when left to endure rather than understood. The idea that pain was natural lingered. The idea that intervention was indulgent persisted. The idea that survival proved adequacy remained deeply rooted. Women continued to be praised for toughness rather than supported for vulnerability. That praise sounded positive. It was not. It encouraged silence. It rewarded endurance. It discouraged complaint. And those patterns echoed far beyond the Middle Ages. Medical authority replaced religious authority, but the posture stayed familiar. Experts spoke. Bodies complied. Outcomes were interpreted through behavior rather than conditions. If something went wrong, questions still drifted toward what the woman had done. What she ate. How she rested. Whether she worried too much. Whether she wanted the child enough. These are not medieval questions. They are inherited ones. The medieval world normalized the idea that pregnancy was something women should manage correctly rather than something society should support safely. That shift in responsibility is subtle. And devastating. Because when responsibility rests entirely on the individual, systems escape accountability. Hospitals improve slowly. Practices change reluctantly. And harm is rebranded as inevitability. The shadow of medieval thinking can be seen in how long it took pain relief to be accepted during childbirth. In how women's reports of pain were minimized. In how maternal mortality was tolerated far longer than it should have been. In how complications were framed as rare tragedies rather than indicators of systemic failure. History does not repeat cleanly. It mutates. It disguises itself as tradition. As strength. As normal. What makes medieval pregnancy especially important is not how strange it was. But how familiar parts of it still feel. The expectation to endure. The pressure to perform wellness. The quiet guilt attached to outcomes beyond control. These are not relics. They are residues. And residues matter. Because they influence decisions. They shape policies. They determine what research is funded. What pain is treated. What suffering is accepted. Humanity did not almost erase itself because medieval people were foolish. They were logical inside a flawed framework. They trusted authority. They followed rules. They moralized biology. And those instincts have not disappeared. They only change language. This is why studying these systems matters. Not to feel superior. But to recognize patterns before they harden again. Because whenever survival is praised more than safety, history is preparing to repeat itself quietly. Pregnancy, then, becomes more than a historical topic. It becomes a lens. A way to see how societies treat bodies that create the future. Whether they are protected. Or tested. Whether care is proactive. Or conditional. The medieval world chose testing. Again and again. And humanity paid for it slowly. In loss. In weakness. In shortened lives. Yet survival continued. Not because the system worked. But because people adapted inside it. They always do. Until adaptation is no longer enough. Then change happens. Often late. Often reluctantly. Often after unnecessary damage. Let the quiet stretch here. The fan hum. The low light. The sense of time softening. This is not a story of villains. It is a story of confidence without curiosity. Of systems that meant well. Of harm that accumulated gently enough to be tolerated. Until it almost wasn't. Humanity survived medieval pregnancy the same way it survives many of its worst ideas. By enduring them long enough to outgrow them. Not cleanly. Not completely. But enough. And that endurance, while impressive, should never be mistaken for wisdom. As the story drifts further back from specifics and closer to reflection, something becomes clearer. The danger was never just medieval pregnancy. It was the habit of treating survival as proof that harm was acceptable. This habit feels ancient. But it is not confined to the past. In the medieval world, outcomes spoke louder than experience. If enough people lived, the system was considered justified. The ones who did not were absorbed into silence. No data. No revision. Just absence. This way of thinking allowed enormous damage to hide inside continuity. Life went on. Births continued. Which meant questioning felt unnecessary. The system appeared to function. And when systems appear to function, suffering becomes invisible. Especially when it happens privately. Especially when it happens inside bodies already expected to endure. Pregnancy was private. Labor was private. Recovery was private. Death was often private. This privacy protected the structure. It kept failure fragmented. Each loss felt individual. Personal. Unfortunate. Never systemic. And that fragmentation prevented outrage. No single death proved the system wrong. No single survival proved it right. So belief filled the gap. Belief is efficient. It explains without measuring. It comforts without correcting. It offers meaning when meaning is easier than change. The medieval world leaned heavily on meaning. It needed to. Life was unstable. Disease constant. Death frequent. Meaning was a way to cope. But meaning, when it replaces evidence, becomes dangerous. Pregnancy became meaningful. Suffering became purposeful. Pain became instructive. These interpretations stabilized emotions. They did not stabilize bodies. Over time, endurance itself became an identity. Women were praised for it. Communities depended on it. Culture reinforced it. And once endurance becomes identity, asking for relief feels like failure. This psychological shift mattered as much as any medical error. Because it shaped behavior. Women delayed care. Accepted pain. Downplayed symptoms. All to remain worthy. This is one of the quiet ways humanity nearly reduced itself too far. Not by ignorance alone. But by internalizing harm as normal. When people stop expecting safety, systems stop providing it. The medieval period is full of examples like this. Pregnancy is simply one of the clearest. Because it sits at the intersection of biology, morality, labor, and survival. It reveals how societies treat what they depend on most. And medieval society depended on women's bodies profoundly. Yet it protected them poorly. Not out of cruelty. Out of habit. Habits, once formed, are difficult to dismantle. They persist even when conditions change. They persist even when better knowledge arrives. They persist because they feel familiar. And familiarity feels safe. Even when it isn't. As the centuries moved on, improvements came. Slowly. Unevenly. Often resisted. But they came. Nutrition improved. Sanitation improved. Medical understanding advanced. And with each improvement, something interesting happened. Mortality dropped. Not dramatically at first. But enough to be noticeable. Enough to raise questions. Enough to suggest that suffering had never been necessary. That endurance had never been the point. That survival did not require punishment. These realizations did not arrive triumphantly. They arrived quietly. In midwives' notes. In family habits. In outcomes that contradicted doctrine. And doctrine, eventually, had to bend. Not because it wanted to, but because reality kept intruding. This is how harmful systems end. Not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. When better ways work too well to ignore. Even then, echoes remain. Because belief systems outlast their usefulness. They linger in language. In expectations. In praise. In silence. The medieval world passed on many things. Architecture. Law. Agriculture. It also passed on assumptions about pain, endurance, and worth. Understanding this is not about blame. It's about recognition. Recognition that humanity often comes closest to harming itself when it mistakes tradition for truth. When it confuses survival with success. When it treats bodies as instruments rather than lives. Pregnancy, in the medieval world, was never just biological. It was symbolic. Moral. Economic. And those layers made it dangerous. Because complexity discouraged simplicity. And simplicity is often where safety begins. Let the mind rest here. The room quiet. The weight of history distant but present. This is not a call to judgment. It's an invitation to notice patterns. To remember that systems built on certainty rarely question themselves. And that questioning, while uncomfortable, is often what keeps humanity from repeating its closest calls. As the night deepens, the story no longer needs new facts. It needs space. Because what remains is not information, but understanding. The medieval world did not wake up one morning and decide to endanger itself. It behaved the way humans often do when overwhelmed. It relied on what felt solid. Tradition. Authority. Explanation. Those things provided structure in a world that offered very little stability. Pregnancy, like many aspects of life, was folded into that structure. And once folded in, it became difficult to separate what helped from what harmed. That is how danger hides. Not in chaos, but in order. Order tells people where they belong. What to do. What to expect. And when suffering fits neatly into that order, it stops being questioned. It becomes background. Like cold in winter. Like hunger before harvest. Like pain in childbirth. The medieval system did not aim for cruelty. It aimed for coherence. For a story that explained why things happened the way they did. And that story placed responsibility on individuals rather than systems. On women rather than conditions. On morality rather than biology. This made life feel understandable. It did not make it safer. Over time, this coherence became comforting. People knew what to expect. What was praised. What was blamed. Certainty reduces anxiety. Even when it increases risk. That trade-off is one humanity has made repeatedly. It is making it still. This is why medieval pregnancy matters beyond its time. It shows how easily care becomes conditional. How support becomes judgment. How endurance becomes virtue. And how virtue can be weaponized against those who need help most. The people who lived through this were not foolish. They were adaptive. They learned how to survive inside a system that did not prioritize them. They learned when to obey. When to ignore. When to pass knowledge quietly. That quiet knowledge is why humanity continued. Not doctrine. Not authority. Experience. Experience shared in whispers. In kitchens. In midwives' hands. In small deviations that added up over generations. History rarely records those moments. It prefers declarations. Reforms. Edicts. But survival often comes from smaller acts. From people doing what works despite what they're told. This is why change feels slow. Because it is happening at the level of habit long before it reaches the level of policy. By the time official medicine began to improve outcomes meaningfully, people had already been improving them informally for centuries. The system caught up to practice. Not the other way around. And when it did, it claimed credit. This pattern is not unique to pregnancy. It appears wherever authority speaks louder than bodies. Where tradition resists evidence. Where survival is praised more than safety. The medieval world is simply a clear mirror. One that shows how close humanity can come to erasing itself without noticing. Not through disaster. But through normal life conducted confidently. That is the unsettling lesson. And it is also the reassuring one. Because if harm can accumulate quietly, so can correction. If bad systems persist through habit, better ones can too. It just takes time. Attention. And the willingness to question what feels normal. Let the breathing slow here. Let the thoughts drift. The medieval night was long. Cold. Quiet. People slept knowing tomorrow would demand endurance again. And yet they slept. Because rest was necessary. Because the body insists on recovery even when the world does not. That insistence is what carried humanity through. Not wisdom. Not foresight. But resilience built into flesh. The story of medieval pregnancy is not one of failure. It is one of survival under unnecessary pressure. Which is, in many ways, the story of humanity itself. We can keep drifting in this space. Letting the rhythm hold. Letting the weight fade. The longer you sit with it, the clearer something becomes. Humanity's closest calls are rarely loud. They don't arrive with fire in the sky or monsters at the gate. They arrive dressed as normal days. As routines. As rules everyone agrees make sense. Medieval pregnancy did not feel like danger while it was happening. It felt like life. Hard life. But life as expected. That expectation was the real threat. Because expectation dulls alarm. When pain is expected, it is not investigated. When death is expected, it is not prevented. When survival is rare but consistent, it is treated as proof enough. The medieval world operated on proof by continuation. We are still here. Therefore, it works. This logic ignores cost. It ignores who didn't make it. It ignores how many were lost to produce those who remained. But history often ignores cost. It counts outcomes. Not effort. Not suffering. Not unnecessary loss. In that way, the medieval system was successful. It did not wipe humanity out. It only narrowed it. Thinned it. Weakened it repeatedly and relied on biological stubbornness to recover. Again. And again. And again. What feels unsettling is not how wrong the system was. It's how familiar the thinking feels. How easily humans accept harm when it arrives wrapped in explanation. How quickly suffering becomes normal when everyone suffers together. How rare it is for a system to say, "This hurts too much. We should stop." Pregnancy revealed this clearly because it forced confrontation with limits. The body could only endure so much. And when it failed, belief stepped in to explain why. Explanation replaced correction. This is one of the quiet patterns that nearly ends things. When explanation satisfies curiosity, curiosity stops. When curiosity stops, improvement stalls. And stagnation, over long enough time, becomes danger. The medieval world stalled in many ways. But it also moved. Slowly. Unevenly. Sometimes accidentally. Because humans are not only creatures of belief. They are creatures of experience. Experience kept whispering truths that doctrine refused to hear. That food matters. That rest matters. That bleeding weakens. That warmth helps. That pain is not always meaningful. Those whispers never stopped. They just weren't amplified. And amplification is what systems control. The result was a long tension between what people knew privately and what they obeyed publicly. That tension defined daily life. Especially for women. Especially for mothers. Especially for those whose bodies were treated as vessels for continuity rather than lives worth protecting. If you listen closely to medieval history, you hear very little screaming. Not because it wasn't painful. But because screaming was not recorded. What survives are rules. Texts. Edicts. Not the lived reality of endurance. That reality existed anyway. It always does. And it is often where survival is decided. Humanity did not almost disappear because medieval people were reckless. They were careful. Too careful with tradition. Too careful with belief. Too respectful of authority. Too reluctant to say, "This hurts more than it helps." That sentence is dangerous to systems. Because once spoken, it spreads. And medieval systems were built to prevent spread. Control knowledge. Control interpretation. Control blame. But bodies are poor at obedience. They react. They fail. They adapt. They force reconsideration simply by not behaving as expected. That friction is what saved humanity. Not progress. Not enlightenment. Friction. Enough people quietly doing things differently to keep the population just barely above collapse. That is not a comforting thought. But it is a real one. Survival does not require perfection. It requires margin. The medieval world lived with very little margin. Every pregnancy was a gamble. Every birth a negotiation. Every survival a small victory against a system that did not fully support it. Let the quiet stretch again. No urgency. No conclusion yet. Just the slow understanding that history's most dangerous moments often look like ordinary life continuing as usual. And that awareness itself, slow, calm, unalarmed, is one of the few things that prevents repetition. We can stay here longer. Letting the thoughts soften. Letting the story breathe. Eventually, even the idea of almost begins to feel generous. Because what medieval humanity survived was not a single edge. It was a long ledge. One that people walked along for centuries without realizing how narrow it was. Pregnancy was only one place where the drop was visible. There were many others. But pregnancy mattered more than most, because it decided whether tomorrow existed at all. And tomorrow existed only because enough bodies held together under pressure that should have broken them. That pressure was not always dramatic. Most days, it was quiet. It was a woman waking before dawn, already tired. It was eating less than she needed because food had to last. It was working through discomfort because stopping meant falling behind. It was accepting pain because pain was expected. It was not thinking of survival as something to optimize. It was thinking of survival as something to endure. Endurance shaped everything. It shaped posture. Speech. Silence. Expectations. People did not ask whether life could be safer. They asked whether it could be borne. And that question changes the kind of answers you get. When the goal is endurance, systems are designed to test. When the goal is safety, systems are designed to support. The medieval world chose the first without ever consciously choosing it all. It simply inherited it. That inheritance passed through families the same way beliefs always do. Not through instruction. Through observation. Through what children saw normalized. Through what was praised. Through what was ignored. Girls learned early that their bodies would one day be examined for usefulness. Not health. Not comfort. Usefulness. They learned that pain was private. That fear was unhelpful. That silence was respectable. Boys learned that outcomes mattered more than process. That authority was unquestioned. That explanations were sufficient. These lessons did not stay medieval. They traveled. They evolved. They softened. But they did not disappear. Which is why looking back is not an act of superiority. It is an act of recognition. Because the danger was never ignorance alone. It was confidence without feedback. A closed loop where belief justified outcome and outcome justified belief. That loop nearly thinned humanity beyond recovery. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But gradually. Through attrition. Through exhaustion. Through systems that demanded more than bodies could sustainably give. And yet, bodies gave anyway. They compensated. They adapted. They paid the cost internally. And that internal cost was invisible. Until it accumulated. Until it showed up as loss. As shortened lives. As generational weakness. As communities always one bad season away from collapse. If the medieval world had experienced one more sustained catastrophe layered on top of what already existed, the balance might not have held. That is the quiet truth. Survival margins were thin. Recovery slow. Resilience finite. Humanity came close not because of one mistake, but because of thousands of small ones treated as normal. This is the part that matters most. Not the bloodletting. Not the starvation advice. Not the rituals. But the normalization. Once harm becomes routine, it stops triggering alarm. And when alarm stops, correction stops. That is when systems become dangerous. The medieval world eventually changed not because it wanted to. But because it had to. Because the quiet compensation of bodies reached limits. Because outcomes forced reconsideration. Because whispered knowledge became too widespread to ignore. Because reality intruded. Reality always does. It just takes time. And time, in the medieval world, was measured in lives. Let that sit. Not as horror. But as perspective. Humanity's survival has often depended less on wisdom than on tolerance for damage. That is not flattering. But it is honest. And honesty is where improvement begins. The medieval night was long. People slept knowing tomorrow would not be easier. Only familiar. And familiarity can be comforting enough to accept almost anything. That acceptance is what nearly ended things. Unawareness is what keeps it from happening again. Slowly. Quietly. Without drama. There is a point, late in the telling, where the mind stops cataloging mistakes and starts noticing something else. Not the danger. But the narrowness of the escape. Because when you step back far enough, medieval pregnancy is not an isolated failure. It is a stress test. One of the longest, quietest stress tests humanity has ever run on itself. And it barely passed. The system worked only because bodies absorbed what institutions would not. Because individuals compensated where structures refused. Because resilience filled gaps that care should have closed. That is not design. That is luck stretched thin. In the medieval world, no one stood outside the system. Everyone participated. Everyone reinforced it simply by surviving inside it. And survival itself became evidence. If you lived, the rules must have been correct. If you died, the rules explained why. That circular logic is powerful. It removes the need for doubt. And doubt is uncomfortable. Especially when life already is. So people leaned into certainty. They trusted what had always been said. They followed what had always been done. They passed it on. Not because it worked well. But because it worked often enough. Often enough is a dangerous standard. Often enough allows harm to hide in averages. Often enough permits loss as background noise. Often enough feels safe right up until it isn't. Pregnancy revealed the limits of often enough repeatedly. Every loss was personal. Every survival collective. Which meant grief stayed individual while belief stayed communal. That imbalance protected the system. It kept responsibility diffuse. No single rule caused death. No single belief failed decisively. Everything contributed just a little. And, just a little, rarely feels urgent. This is how long-running harm survives scrutiny. It is never loud enough. Never clear enough. Never concentrated enough to demand immediate change. It just continues. And medieval life was full of continuations. Continuing despite hunger. Despite cold. Despite disease. Despite loss. Continuing became a skill. A virtue. A necessity. When continuation is the highest value, optimization feels unnecessary. Why improve what is still moving? Why change what has not stopped? The answer, from a modern perspective, seems obvious. But from inside the medieval world, stopping was not an option. Questioning risked destabilizing the only order people knew. And instability was terrifying. So harm remained preferable to uncertainty. That preference nearly cost humanity more than it could afford. Because population recovery requires surplus. And surplus requires care. Not endurance. Care was sporadic. Localized. Often informal. Which meant it could not scale. The system scaled suffering instead. Uniform rules. Uniform expectations. Uniform explanations. They created consistency. Not safety. Consistency is comforting. Safety is corrective. The medieval world chose comfort. Unintentionally. But consistently. And in doing so, it walked that long ledge. Year after year. Generation after generation. Until eventually, slowly, the ground widened. Not because the ledge was acknowledged. But because the terrain changed. Technology. Knowledge. Resources. Enough shifted that the old rules began to fail more visibly. When failure became obvious, belief lost some of its grip. But only then. Only when evidence became unavoidable. This delay is important to remember. Because it shows how much damage can occur before systems admit error. How much loss can be absorbed before correction begins. Pregnancy was one of the places where this delay mattered most. Because every delay was measured in lives that never arrived. Or lives that arrived and did not stay. And yet, humanity did not disappear. Which means the margin held. Barely. Through quiet adaptation. Through bodies doing what beliefs could not. Through people caring in small ways even when doctrine discouraged it. That quiet care is easy to miss. But it is what made the difference. Not grand reform. Not enlightened leadership. Small acts. Repeated. Unrecorded. Enough to keep the line from breaking. But that it was flexible. Even when systems were rigid. Even when rules were wrong. Life bent. It did not snap. And that bending, slow, imperfect, costly, is why there is still a story to tell at all. Let the quiet settle again. No conclusion needed. No lesson underlined. At this point, the story becomes less about what happened and more about what almost didn't. Because survival, when it is narrow, leaves a certain aftertaste. Not triumph. Relief. The medieval world lived in that space without naming it. People did not celebrate resilience. They relied on it. They assumed it. They built their lives on the expectation that things would hurt and continue anyway. Pregnancy fit perfectly into that expectation. It was not framed as something to protect. It was framed as something to withstand. That framing mattered. Because what you frame as withstandable, you rarely make safer. You only ask people to bear it better. Over time, bearing became skill. A social requirement. A moral badge. And once bearing pain becomes admirable, removing pain feels suspicious. This is one of the quiet traps of endurance cultures. They confuse strength with exposure. They praise those who survive harm rather than asking why harm exists. The medieval world was an endurance culture by necessity. But necessity hardened into identity. And identity resists revision. So pregnancy remained dangerous longer than it needed to. Not because no one noticed. But because noticing did not automatically grant permission to change. Change requires authority to feel uncertain. And medieval authority was built on certainty. Texts were ancient. Traditions sacred. Interpretations layered with meaning. To question them felt destabilizing. So people adjusted around them instead. Quietly. Privately. A woman ate a little more than advised. A midwife delayed a bleed. A family ignored a fast. None of this rewrote doctrine. But it kept people alive. Enough people. This pattern, private correction beneath public conformity, is how many harmful systems persist without collapsing. They function just well enough. They fail just slowly enough. And because they do not fail catastrophically, they are never fully abandoned. Humanity walked that line for centuries. Pregnancy was one of the clearest tests of how much a body could give before giving out. And bodies gave. Again and again. Until giving became expectation. Until expectation became pressure. Until pressure became tradition. At no point did medieval society pause and ask whether this pressure was necessary. It asked whether it was meaningful. Meaning replaced measurement. And meaning, while comforting, is not protective. The unsettling realization is that medieval people were not especially different from us. They used the tools they had. They trusted what seemed authoritative. They avoided uncertainty. They adapted within constraints. They normalized what they could not change. These are human responses. Timeless ones. Which is why this story does not feel finished. Because the impulse it describes did not end. It just moved. Changed context. Changed language. Changed institutions. The medieval world did not nearly erase itself because it was cruel. It nearly erased itself because it tolerated damage as the price of continuity. Because it accepted suffering as background. Because it praised survival instead of asking why survival required so much sacrifice. That tolerance is the real risk. Not ignorance. Not superstition. But acceptance. Acceptance that things are just hard. That pain is just part of it. That improvement can wait. Humanity survived medieval pregnancy not because it mastered it. But because it endured it long enough to stumble into better conditions later. That is not a strategy. It is a narrow escape. And narrow escapes deserve attention. Not panic. Not judgment. Just awareness. Awareness that systems can harm quietly. That danger does not need to announce itself. That what feels normal can still be lethal over time. Let the quiet stretch here. No need to rush forward. No need to resolve. Just the steady sense of how close ordinary life can come to ending everything without anyone ever meaning to. By now, the pattern should feel familiar. Not because you've heard it before. But because it lives somewhere deeper than memory. Human societies drift toward endurance when care feels expensive. They drift toward explanation when correction feels risky. They drift toward tradition when uncertainty threatens stability. The medieval world did all three at once. And pregnancy sat quietly at the center of it. A process so essential that it could not be paused. So dangerous that it demanded explanation. So common that its cost became invisible. When something happens often enough, people stop asking whether it should happen that way. They ask only how to survive it again. That was the medieval approach. Survive again. Survive one more winter. One more birth. One more loss. One more season of thinning margins. Survival became cyclical. Not progressive. Each generation did not necessarily live better. It merely lived again. And that distinction matters. Progress requires memory. Endurance requires forgetting. Forgetting how bad it was. Forgetting how close it came. Forgetting that alternatives might exist. Pregnancy encouraged forgetting. Because once a birth was over, attention moved on. There was always another body. Another need. Another demand. Recovery was rushed not out of cruelty, but momentum. Life did not slow. And systems that do not slow rarely improve. They repeat. The medieval world repeated itself with remarkable consistency. The same advice. The same rituals. The same assumptions. The same risks. And the same narrow escape. It escaped not because it learned quickly. But because human reproduction has a brutal kind of redundancy. Enough births happen that even high loss does not immediately end things. That buffer is deceptive. It allows systems to ignore harm. It gives the illusion of safety while quietly draining resilience. Pregnancy loss did not alarm medieval society because it did not stop society. It only hurt people. Individually. Privately. And private pain rarely triggers reform. Reform is driven by public failure. Pregnancy rarely failed publicly. It failed in homes. In fields. In rooms filled with women whose names were not recorded. That invisibility protected the system. The medieval world did not see itself as reckless. It saw itself as disciplined. Structured. Morally ordered. And moral order can justify enormous harm without ever calling it harm. When suffering is moralized, it stops being a problem to solve. It becomes a lesson to endure. That is the heart of the danger. And that danger does not belong to the past. It belongs to any system that confuses meaning with mitigation. That explains pain instead of reducing it. That praises endurance instead of asking why endurance is required. The medieval period simply shows this at scale. Over centuries. With bodies paying the price. What makes this unsettling is not how alien it feels. But how recognizable it is. The instinct to say, this is just how it is. The instinct to trust authority over experience. The instinct to value continuity over comfort. These instincts kept medieval society stable. They also kept it fragile. Stability and fragility often coexist. The medieval world was stable enough to persist. Fragile enough to nearly collapse. Again and again. Pregnancy exposed that fragility constantly. Every birth was a reminder that survival was not guaranteed. Yet instead of prompting change, it prompted ritual. Ritual feels safer than revision. It creates the impression of control. Even when control is absent. Even when outcomes do not improve. Ritual filled the space where medicine failed. And belief filled the space where evidence was ignored. This layering of reassurance over risk is how societies tolerate danger for long periods. They do not deny it. They narrate it. They turn it into story. Into virtue. Into destiny. The medieval story of pregnancy was one of endurance rewarded. Even when reward came only in the form of continued existence. That story held long enough for humanity to stagger forward. Barely. This is not a heroic story. It is a cautionary one. But caution does not need urgency to be effective. It needs recognition. The recognition that systems do not have to be malicious to be harmful. That good intentions do not prevent damage. That survival does not prove correctness. These are quiet truths. They do not shout. They do not demand immediate action. They simply sit with you. The way this story sits now. Unfinished. Unresolved. Because history does not end with lessons learned. It ends with lessons available. Whether they are noticed depends on whether we pause long enough to see them. So let the pause linger. The lights low. The room steady. The sense of time loosening. Medieval humanity walked a narrow path for centuries and did not fall. Not because the path was safe. But because enough people kept their balance long enough to move forward. Balance is not safety. It is effort. And effort, sustained without care, eventually costs more than it can give. That cost is what this story leaves behind. Not fear. Not judgment. Just awareness. At this depth, the story no longer needs to warn. It simply observes. Because what nearly happened did not require intention. It required momentum. The medieval world moved forward because it always had. Because stopping was not built into the system. There was no pause button. No institutional moment of reflection. Only continuation. Pregnancy fit seamlessly into that motion. It happened whether conditions were ready or not. Whether bodies were rested or not. Whether food was available or not. And because it could not be delayed easily, it was treated as inevitable rather than improvable. Inevitability is a powerful anesthetic. When something feels inevitable, effort shifts from prevention to acceptance. From redesign to endurance. That shift happened early and stayed. Once endurance becomes the expected response, care begins to feel optional. Helpful. But not necessary. And optional care is the first thing to disappear when resources tighten. The medieval world tightened often. Famine. War. Disease. Climate shifts. Each crisis stripped away margins. And pregnancy absorbed the loss quietly. Women absorbed it quietly. Their bodies compensated until they couldn't. And when they couldn't, belief stepped in to explain why. That explanation protected the system from self-examination. Because if failure is moral, there is nothing to fix. Only something to endure better next time. This cycle repeated for centuries. Not because no one questioned it. But because questioning rarely led to change. Change required coordination. Authority. Permission. And permission was guarded carefully. Especially when it threatened existing structures. So improvement arrived sideways. Indirectly. Through habits. Through quiet choices. Through people doing what worked without announcing it. That kind of change is slow. But it is also resilient. It does not provoke backlash. It does not require consensus. It simply spreads because it helps. A woman eats more and survives. A midwife avoids bleeding and a mother recovers. A child kept warm lives longer. These outcomes accumulate. Not in books. In bodies. In memories. In communities. Eventually, those outcomes become too consistent to ignore. But that, eventually, can take generations. And it did. The medieval world paid for delay in lives. In shortened lifespans. In constant replenishment rather than growth. Humanity survived, but always just above the threshold. Which meant it remained vulnerable. One more plague. One more extended famine. One more climatic shift. Any of these could have tipped the balance. The margin was that thin. What saved humanity was not foresight. It was redundancy. Enough people. Enough births. Enough adaptation. Enough quiet correction to prevent collapse. This is not comforting. But it is honest. History is not a story of smooth progress. It is a story of damage managed just well enough to continue. Pregnancy shows this clearly because it reveals how much was asked of bodies to maintain continuity. Bodies were expected to bridge gaps left by systems. And they did. At great cost. When modern observers look back, the temptation is to ask how people could have accepted this. But acceptance is easier than change when change feels dangerous. The medieval world feared disorder more than suffering. Order felt protective. Even when it wasn't. Even when it produced harm. That preference shaped everything. From medicine. To morality. To daily life. Pregnancy was simply one of the places where the consequences were unavoidable. Because bodies eventually reveal truth. They fail. They recover. They adapt. They signal limits whether belief listens or not. Those signals were always there. Faint. Often ignored. But persistent. They were the quiet resistance that kept humanity alive. Not rebellion. Not reform. Persistence. Persistence in doing what worked when possible. Persistence in caring despite rules. Persistence in adjusting even when doctrine resisted. That persistence is easy to overlook because it is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It just continues. Like life did. And still does. The medieval world did not almost end humanity in a single moment. It almost did so slowly. By tolerating too much. For too long. And that slow danger is harder to see. Harder to fear. Harder to correct. Which is why stories like this matter. Not to shock. Not to judge. But to remind. That what feels normal deserves occasional examination. That survival is not the same as success. That endurance is not proof of safety. These are quiet realizations. They arrive best in silence. In low light. The farther you drift into it, the more the story stops feeling historical. It starts feeling structural. Because what defined medieval pregnancy was not the century. It was the mindset. A mindset that says, this is how it has always been, and quietly treats that sentence as the end of inquiry. The medieval world did not lack intelligence. It lacked feedback loops. When outcomes did not improve, belief absorbed the failure. When belief absorbed failure, nothing changed. And pregnancy kept happening inside that loop. Relentlessly. Predictably. Unforgivingly. The body would give signals. Weakness. Bleeding. Fever. Exhaustion. Loss. Those signals were not ignored. They were interpreted. Interpretation replaced response. Response would have required admitting uncertainty. Uncertainty threatened order. Order mattered more than accuracy. So accuracy waited. For centuries. What's striking is how little cruelty was required. No villain. No conspiracy. Just people doing what felt right inside a shared framework. That's what makes it dangerous. Harm driven by certainty is quieter than harm driven by malice. It doesn't look like violence. It looks like tradition. It looks like responsibility. It looks like people doing their best. Pregnancy suffered inside that goodness. Inside that sincerity. Because sincerity does not protect against error. It often entrenches it. The medieval world believed it was managing risk. Balancing humors. Appeasing God. Maintaining moral order. But risk management without measurement becomes ritual. And ritual cannot tell you when it fails. It only tells you when it has been performed. So births continued. Deaths continued. And the ratio stayed just high enough to continue. Just low enough to avoid panic. That balance is eerie. Because it suggests how close systems can come to collapse without triggering reform. They don't have to be wrong enough to fail. They just have to be wrong enough to hurt. Pregnancy was hurt made routine. Pain made meaningful. Loss made expected. And expectation is powerful. It shapes what people prepare for. Not survival, but endurance. When endurance is the goal, support feels optional. And optional support disappears under pressure. Pressure was constant. Which meant support was intermittent at best. Women learned to rely on each other. On experience. On intuition. On things that worked even when they weren't approved. This informal network did more for survival than official medicine ever did. But because it was informal, it remained invisible. And invisibility does not earn reform. It earns neglect. The medieval world could not see what was saving it. Which meant it could not strengthen it. It continued to invest in what felt authoritative instead. Texts. Rules. Explanations. An authority is slow to admit it has been wrong for centuries. So correction crept in sideways. Through habit. Through outcomes. Through the quiet accumulation of lived knowledge. That kind of change does not feel like progress while it's happening. It feels like coping. Like getting through another day. Another birth. Another winter. And coping, when extended over generations, starts to look like culture. That culture shaped expectations long after medieval conditions faded. The idea that pregnancy is supposed to hurt. That struggle is normal. That risk is unavoidable. These ideas survived improvements in nutrition, sanitation, and medicine. They lingered because they had been normalized. Because once something has always hurt, relief feels optional. Even suspicious. This is the long shadow. Not medieval ignorance. Medieval normalization. The habit of accepting harm when it does not stop the world from turning. Humanity survived because it could tolerate a great deal. That tolerance is both strength and weakness. It allows continuation. But it also delays correction. And delay, over long spans of time, becomes its own kind of danger. The medieval world lived on delay. Delayed understanding. Delayed reform. Delayed care. And paid for it gradually. Quietly. Without collapse. Which made the cost harder to see. Until you step back. Until you slow down. Until you notice how narrow the margin really was. And how easily it could have failed. Let that awareness sit gently. Not as alarm. As recognition. That systems don't have to be evil to be dangerous. They only have to be confident enough not to listen. And listening, real listening, has always been the rarest corrective humanity possesses. When medieval healers weren't busy feeding their patients poison with a cheerful smile, they turned to the next brilliant strategy, magical thinking dressed as medicine. Charms, amulets, and prayers weren't just superstition, they were professional tools. If the body failed, clearly the soul was misbehaving. And if the soul misbehaved, it needed guidance, discipline, and occasionally expensive trinkets worn around the neck. The richer the charm, the more potent the cure, at least in theory. Gold, gemstones, intricate knots of string, tiny bells, every item had a purpose. And every item had a cost. For peasants, this meant bartering livestock, grain, or the occasional goat for a pendant that promised nothing. For nobles, it meant a small fortune vanishing into the hands of priests, magicians, or alchemists who were equally confident in their solutions. The logic was airtight: spend money, acquire charm, disease retreats. If disease didn't retreat, simply buy a more expensive charm. Problem solved. Or not, but optimism matters. Meanwhile, hygiene remained an ongoing medieval enigma. Soap existed, sometimes, but cleanliness was not about health, it was about modesty, aesthetics, and occasionally avoiding sin. Bathing was suspiciously linked to morality. Too clean, and one might attract demonic attention or temptation. Too dirty, and one might catch, well, everything else, but blame would fall elsewhere. So most people bathed once or twice a year, often in groups, sometimes outdoors, often with more courage than discretion. Shared baths, reused water, and the occasional floating insect were all part of the communal experience. Smells became social signals, much like today's fashion trends, except more potent and far less voluntary. Medieval people didn't know germs, but they excelled in creative exposure. Education offered no respite. Scholars, monks, and scribes held knowledge as a sacred duty, which included documenting disasters, cures, and occasionally terrible advice. Books were rare, expensive, and written in Latin, a language most peasants couldn't read. That meant critical information, like how to survive a plague, often stayed locked in monasteries while the rest of the population experimented in real time. Letters of advice could travel across regions, but they moved slower than the disease itself. By the time anyone read the proper method to treat a fever, the fever had already treated itself, or treated the patient fatally. And then there was warfare. If disease and bad medicine weren't enough to keep humanity on edge, the next generation of leaders decided that conquering neighboring regions during plagues was a splendid idea. Armies on the move carried not only swords but also fleas, lice, and general misfortune. Sieges meant starving populations in cramped quarters, perfect for infection and moral despair. Attackers didn't just fight soldiers, they fought logistics, illness, and occasionally the town's own misguided attempts at defense. Catapults tossed not only rocks but occasionally rotting bodies over walls, accelerating epidemics for everyone involved. War, disease, famine, and magical thinking combined to create a perfect storm of medieval human endurance testing. Religion, predictably, played a dual role. Clergy provided comfort, guidance, and, occasionally, advice that would today make emergency room staff blush. Pilgrimages promised divine favor, penances could cleanse sins, and relics were said to have healing powers. People traveled miles, often sick, in search of miracles. In doing so, they spread their illnesses far and wide. Churches became disease hubs, holy water basins became petri dishes, and prayers were whispered alongside coughs. Hope existed, yes, but it was a logistical hazard. Faith didn't prevent death, it merely accompanied it. Travel itself was a gamble. Roads were muddy, unsafe, and teeming with crime. Inns offered beds with fleas, rats, and occasionally the host's unwashed relatives. Fresh water was rare, and spoiled food a constant companion. Travelers needed luck, strength, and a tolerance for near-constant discomfort. Those who made it to their destination often carried new illnesses back home, spreading outbreaks further. Medieval infrastructure was simultaneously impressive and terrifyingly naive. Bridges, aqueducts, and roads existed, but disease didn't respect architecture. Even leisure offered hazards. Festivals, markets, and public celebrations were crowd-packed, loud, and sticky with unknown substances. Music, dancing, and theater thrived alongside rampant contagion. Everyone wanted to see the latest performance or market fair, often ignoring the fact that standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers meant sharing more than just laughter. Masking, distance, and hygiene were fantasies. Survival was a matter of luck, constitution, and perhaps the mysterious favor of unseen forces. Food storage was another masterpiece of medieval problem-solving. Grain was kept in sacks infested with insects. Meat hung unrefrigerated until it fermented to unrecognizable flavors. Salt preserved some foods, but only those who could afford it. Spoiled items were consumed out of necessity. Recipes often involved heavy seasoning, boiling, or alcohol to hide flavors that modern palates might reject outright. Poisoning, accidental or otherwise, was a persistent companion at every table. And so life continued. Day after day, humans navigated a world where simple survival was an achievement, not a right. Every decision, what to eat, where to sleep, whom to trust, carried immediate consequences. The combination of overconfidence, misunderstanding, and tradition often turned minor issues into major catastrophes. Humanity stumbled forward, simultaneously fragile and resilient, misled and adaptive, doomed and enduring. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was another arena where confident ignorance thrived. Labor was considered a woman's burden, divine punishment, and public matter all at once. Midwives assisted when they could, relying on experience, superstition, and a collection of herbs whose efficacy was highly optimistic. The birthing process was perilous, both for mother and child. Complications often meant death, and there was no calling an ambulance or scheduling a C-section. Instead, prayers, charms, and occasionally painful interventions were employed. Forceps didn't exist in most places, but ropes, hands, and a strong grip on hope did. Women labored surrounded by family, neighbors, and occasionally the local barber surgeon, whose skill set included bloodletting and other forms of medieval medical creativity. Survival depended on luck, constitution, and the gods having a good day. Childhood, unsurprisingly, was equally hazardous. Infants were delicate, easily lost to infections, malnutrition, or anything that today would be preventable. Wet nurses were common among wealthier families, but their practices were inconsistent. Even wealthy children were at risk from poisoned or spoiled milk, poor hygiene, and accidental injury. Education started early for some, but schooling often meant exposure to harsh conditions, long hours, and cold stone rooms. Games, when allowed, involved high risk. Balls, sticks, and primitive playground equipment could maim as easily as they entertained. Life was a training ground in survival from day one. Marriage and family life were governed by a mixture of economics, religion, and social expectation. Love, if it appeared, was often secondary. Marriages arranged for land, alliances, or survival dictated daily life. Women had limited legal rights, and men had responsibilities that ranged from providing food to defending honor, though survival often demanded improvisation. Families were extended, crowded, and constantly negotiating space, resources, and disease exposure. Domestic life was never quiet. Heat, cold, vermin, and work demanded constant attention. Children contributed labor as soon as possible, often in dangerous circumstances. Household efficiency meant risk exposure was normalized. Travel and trade extended these hazards across borders. Caravans, merchant ships, and traveling craftsmen carried goods, and diseases, across regions. Trade brought exotic foods, spices, and luxuries but also unfamiliar pathogens. The concept of quarantine was rudimentary, sometimes more superstition than science. Ports became epicenters of infection, with inspectors relying on prayers, fumigation, or simple hope. Trade improved wealth and variety of life, yes, but also helped diseases hop from city to city, continent to continent. Warfare remained a constant backdrop. Armies weren't just fighting human enemies, they were combating famine, exhaustion, disease, and logistical nightmares. Camp conditions were horrific: open latrines, contaminated water, spoiled food, and close quarters ensured that a small wound could become fatal infection. Even victorious soldiers carried back diseases, unintentionally spreading plague, typhus, or dysentery to home populations. Medieval military strategy was part logistics, part bravery, and part complete misunderstanding of microbiology. Justice and law provided no relief. Courts often involved physical punishment, public humiliation, or execution. Trials relied on confessions coerced by pain, witnesses with biases, and superstition. Criminals were executed publicly, sometimes to maintain social order, sometimes for entertainment. Townspeople crowded streets to watch, increasing exposure to disease and creating chaos that sometimes rivaled the initial crime. Legal certainty was optional, but spectacle was mandatory. Authority, punishment, and public participation created social pressure, reinforced superstition, and ensured that even legal systems contributed to the general instability of life. Religion, in every form, wove into these daily dangers. Monks, priests and nuns acted as doctors, midwives, judges, and spiritual guides. Prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage were prescribed remedies for almost everything. Confession could cure a guilty conscience, but rarely a bacterial infection. Pilgrimages spread disease, monasteries became crowded, and devotional practices often demanded physical strain that weakened bodies already compromised by hunger or illness. Faith offered comfort, yes, but rarely safety. Public spectacles, tournaments, and festivals carried unique dangers. Jousting could maim participants, festivals crowded streets, and music, dancing, and theater gatherings became hotbeds for infection. Celebrations exposed people to heat, cold, human waste, disease, and occasionally accidental injury. Everyone wanted to participate, because life was short, terrifying, and sometimes unbearably dull. Entertainment became a calculated risk. Pleasure and survival were not mutually exclusive, but they rarely aligned. Even infrastructure, when examined closely, was an architectural testament to overconfidence. Bridges and roads were marvels of engineering for their time, yet travelers risked mud, collapse, and robbers daily. Aqueducts supplied cities, but also spread contamination if mismanaged.